At 9 a.m. on January 20th, 2009, an announcement rippled across the global finance world. Heartland Payment Systems, one of the largest payment processing companies in the United States, had suffered a catastrophic data breach. The scale of the crime was almost unfathomable. 130 million credit and debit card numbers stolen in one of the largest cybercrimes the world had ever seen. It was a story of betrayal, audacity, and misused brilliance, with its roots tracing back to a young man who was as enigmatic as he was clever, Albert Gonzalez. Albert was no stranger to technology. Born in Cuba and raised in Miami, he grew up during the dawn of the internet age. While other children played outside, Albert was in his room diving into the burgeoning world of computers, intrigued by the seemingly infinite possibilities they offered. He wasn't just good at it, he was exceptional. Friends would describe him as the kind of kid who could take apart a computer and put it back together with an effortless ease. But Albert's talent was not confined to understanding how machines worked. He had an uncanny knack for understanding how people worked, too. He was fascinated by the psychology behind human behavior, how trust could be exploited, and how curiosity could be leveraged as a tool. It was this understanding of both technology and human nature that would make him so effective in his later exploits. By the time Albert was a teenager, he had discovered the dark side of the internet. It wasn't long before he was frequenting underground forums where hackers shared tips, tricks, and challenges. The adrenaline that came with accessing forbidden data, coupled with the sense of community among the hackers, was intoxicating. It wasn't just about breaking into systems. It was about proving himself in a world that thrived on secrecy and skill. The anonymity, the power, and the thrill of outsmarting others became an addiction for Albert. He would stay up all night, his room dimly lit by the glow of his computer screen, his mind racing with new ideas and new targets. But things changed for Albert in 2003 when he was arrested for hacking. It could have been the end of his story, but instead, it became the beginning of a much more complex chapter. Rather than facing prison time, Albert struck a deal with the U.S. government. He became an informant for the Secret Service, helping them track down other cybercriminals. The irony of a hacker working for the government was not lost on Albert, and perhaps that was part of the appeal. He had always seen himself as an outsider, and now he was playing both sides, living a double life that gave him a unique thrill. The idea of being both the hunter and the hunted, of playing a game that no one else even knew existed, fueled his actions. As an informant, Albert was instrumental in taking down several major hacking operations. He was able to use his insider knowledge to help the government infiltrate and dismantle hacking networks. But the thrill of the chase, the power of being on the inside, and the allure of the forbidden proved too much to resist. Even while working for the government, Albert was secretly orchestrating some of the largest cyber heists in history. He formed a group of like-minded individuals, each with their own unique skills, and together they began to target major corporations. The goal was simple: exploit vulnerabilities, steal data, and make money. For Albert, it wasn't just about the money. It was about power, control, and proving that he could beat the system. The members of the group were diverse. Each had their reasons for joining. Some were in it for the thrill, others for the money, and some, like Albert, for the power and notoriety. They called themselves a digital band of brothers, united by their skills and their disdain for the system. For them, hacking was an art, and they were the masters of the craft. They would spend hours talking in encrypted chat rooms, planning their next move, sharing code, and refining their strategies. Each hack was a puzzle, and solving it was a way to prove themselves not only to the world but to each other. They thrived on the adrenaline rush that came with outsmarting billion-dollar corporations. Albert's double life began to take a toll. The pressure of working for the government, while simultaneously planning and executing cyber attacks, was immense. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if today would be the day that everything came crashing down. The thrill that had once driven him now brought with it a sense of paranoia. He would often find himself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that the authorities had finally caught on. But that fear only added to the thrill. The more he got away with, the more invincible he felt. And then came Heartland Payment Systems, a target so large, so audacious, that even Albert hesitated. But the potential payoff was too great to ignore, and he knew that if anyone could pull it off, it was him. In the months leading up to the breach, Albert and his team meticulously planned their attack. They studied Heartland's systems, identifying vulnerabilities, and figuring out how to exploit them. They used SQL injection, a technique that allowed them to bypass security measures and gain access to the internal network. It was a tried-and-true method, one that Albert had used many times before. But this time, the stakes were higher. The target was bigger, the risks greater, and the potential rewards unimaginable. The planning was extensive, involving countless hours of probing Heartland's defenses, finding weak spots, and determining the best time to strike. They monitored employee activity, looking for patterns, waiting for the perfect moment when security would be at its weakest. On the day of the breach, Albert was calm. He had done this before and he knew what needed to be done. He and his team executed their plan with precision, installing malware that allowed them to capture sensitive card data as transactions were processed. It was almost too easy. The data flowed in, millions of credit and debit card numbers, each one a potential payday. For Albert, it was the culmination of everything he had worked for, the proof that he was the best at what he did. He watched the data stream across his screen, the numbers and information flowing like water, each one a testament to his skill and audacity. But as the data flowed in, so too did a sense of unease. Albert had always prided himself on his ability to stay ahead of the game, to outthink and outmaneuver those who would try to catch him. But something about this job felt different. It was too big, too public, and there were too many variables that could go wrong. He brushed the feeling aside, convincing himself that he was being paranoid. After all, he had outsmarted the government before. What could possibly go wrong this time? But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. A quiet whisper that perhaps this time he had gone too far. The thrill that had once been so exhilarating now felt like a weight around his neck, a reminder of just how much he had to lose. Albert's mind was a storm of thoughts. He had always believed that he could stay one step ahead, that his intellect and skill would keep him safe. But the enormity of what they had done began to sink in. This wasn't just a hack. This was a direct challenge to the financial infrastructure of the United States. The potential consequences were staggering, and for the first time, Albert began to feel the true weight of his actions. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the success of the operation, but the unease persisted. He had always been able to compartmentalize, to separate his actions from their consequences, but now the lines were beginning to blur. The breach at Heartland was a turning point. It was the moment when Albert's ambition crossed the line into recklessness. He had always thrived on risk, but this was different. This was a risk that could bring everything crashing down, not just for him, but for everyone involved. As the days passed and the reality of what they had done began to set in, Albert found himself increasingly on edge. He knew that the authorities would be coming, that it was only a matter of time before they traced the breach back to him. He had always believed that he was untouchable, but now, for the first time, he began to doubt. The tension was palpable within the group. They had pulled off the largest data breach in history, but instead of celebrating, there was a sense of dread. They knew that they had crossed a line, that the world would not take this lying down. For Albert, the thrill was gone, replaced by a growing sense of fear. He had always been able to outsmart the system, but now he was beginning to realize that he had underestimated just how far the system would go to protect itself. The walls were closing in, and Albert knew that it was only a matter of time before his past caught up with him. The walls were closing in, but they hadn't always been this tight. There was a time when Albert Gonzalez and his crew operated with a sense of invincibility, and it all started with the high-profile breaches that put them on the map. Long before Heartland payment systems, there were other targets, TJX companies and Hannaford brothers. This was the proving ground, the stage where they honed their skills, tested their boundaries, and tasted the intoxicating thrill of large-scale cyber intrusion. For Albert, those early successes were stepping stones, each more daring than the last, leading them to the precipice they now stood upon. It was the early months of 2007 when Albert's group hit TJX Companies, the retail giant, whose brands included TJ Maxx and Marshalls. It was a heist that would set the tone for everything that came after. Albert sat in his dimly lit apartment, his eyes glued to his monitor, watching as the data poured in. This was his masterpiece, a carefully orchestrated campaign that exploited vulnerabilities in the company's Wi-Fi networks. By gaining access to the internal systems, the crew siphoned off credit card information over 45 million numbers in all. It was the biggest data breach in history at the time, a monumental score that no one thought possible. Albert's fingers danced across his keyboard, and with every keystroke, he felt the adrenaline rush. He had always been fascinated by the art of breaking in, finding the cracks in seemingly impenetrable systems. It wasn't just about the money. It was the challenge, the sense of power that came from knowing he could outwit billion-dollar corporations. His crew called him Soup Nazi in their private chat rooms, a name that symbolized both his command over technology and his unpredictability. They would stay up late, long after the world had gone to sleep, plotting, coding, and daring each other to go bigger, to aim higher. When the breach at TJX became public, the media coverage was relentless. News anchors called it an unprecedented attack, and security experts scrambled to understand how it had happened. Albert watched the news with a wry smile. There he was, invisible but everywhere, his name unspoken, yet his work on display for the world to see. The thrill of watching the chaos unfold was addictive. He wasn't just a hacker, he was a ghost in the machine, untouchable and unknowable. And for a moment, it seemed as if no one could ever catch him. Then came the Hannaford brothers' breach in early 2008, another opportunity for Albert and his crew to flex their digital muscles. This time, they went after a grocery chain, breaking into the company's point-of-sale systems and capturing millions of card details. It was another calculated attack, meticulously planned and executed. Albert would often describe hacking as an art form, a dance between the intruder and the target. Every move had to be precise, every vulnerability exploited perfectly, or the entire operation would crumble. The Hannaford breach, much like TJX, caused panic and uproar among customers. People wanted answers. How could something like this happen? But to Albert, it was all just a game, a demonstration of his power over a system that had failed to protect itself. He knew how to stay hidden, how to cover his tracks, and how to move in the digital shadows where no one could find him. But what Albert didn't realize was that with every breach, every new headline, he was putting a bigger target on his back. The world was starting to pay attention, and so were the authorities. Albert's crew was intoxicated with their own success. In their encrypted chat rooms, they celebrated, bragging about the numbers, the scale of their heists, and the incompetence of those trying to catch them. They felt untouchable, and in a way they were. They had outsmarted some of the largest corporations in the country, and the money was flowing in. But beneath the bravado, Albert began to feel the pressure mounting. They had pushed boundaries, and now they were on the radar. He knew that each victory came at a price, and that price was growing steeper with every attack. It was during one of these moments of bravado, as they talked about their successes, that the idea of targeting Heartland payment systems first came up. The name was whispered in the chat room, a dare that lingered in the digital air. Heartland wasn't just any target. It was a giant in the payment processing industry, a company that handled millions of transactions daily. The stakes were higher, the risks greater, but so were the potential rewards. Albert knew it was a gamble, but it was one he couldn't resist. The allure of outdoing himself, of proving that he could breach the unbreachable, was too much to pass up. Albert Gonzalez, the mastermind behind the TJX and Hannaford breaches, craved something bigger, a target that would cement his legacy in history. Heartland payment systems fit the bill. Unlike previous targets, Heartland was more secure and operated at a larger scale, handling transactions for thousands of businesses nationwide. For Albert, it wasn't just about stealing data, it was about proving that no one was safe, that security was an illusion. He wanted to challenge the system, to take down a target that would be talked about for years. The The crew was divided. Many feared that the risk was too great, especially considering the attention they'd already garnered. But Albert's persuasive nature and vision of success won them over. He painted a vivid picture of the wealth they could attain and the headlines they would make. Slowly, each member gave in, agreeing to the plan. Heartland would be their next legendary heist. As they planned, Albert's crew mocked companies' attempts at improving security following their previous breaches. They believed no system was invulnerable, and they laughed at the inadequacy of these efforts. They saw the corporate world's cybersecurity measures as nothing more than child's play. But with Heartland, the stakes were higher. The Secret Service was stepping up its investigation, and the pressure was mounting. Albert's informant knowledge of law enforcement tactics gave them an edge, but he knew they were on borrowed time. Despite the thrill, Albert felt an undercurrent of fear. This heist was bigger, more dangerous, and the consequences of failure were greater. The excitement was laced with the realization that they were crossing into new, perilous territory. It wasn't just about the money. It was about leaving behind a legacy. Deep down, Albert knew the walls were closing in. The noose was tightening. But for him, Heartland was the ultimate challenge, the defining moment he'd been working toward. Even with the risks mounting, Albert pushed forward, determined to make his mark, no matter the cost. Heartland would either be their greatest score or their last. The months leading up to the attack were all about preparation. Albert, with his experience and inside knowledge, had a clear vision of how the breach could be executed. The key was in finding vulnerabilities, the tiniest crack in Heartland's defenses that would allow them to slip in unnoticed. They found that vulnerability through SQL injection, a method that allowed them to bypass security protocols in the company's web applications. It was a technique they had used many times before, but this time, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Heartland was a behemoth, processing more than 100 million card transactions every month, and Albert knew that breaching their systems would require meticulous planning and flawless execution. Over the weeks, he and the group mapped out their strategy, rehearsed it, refined it, and obsessed over every detail. They were relentless, poring over data, analyzing every line of code, looking for the perfect entry point. To Albert, this was not just another job. It was his magnum opus, the operation that would cement his name in the annals of cybercrime history. On the day of the breach in 2008, Albert sat at his desk, his face illuminated by the flickering light of his computer screen. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the steady tapping of keys as he worked. His heart pounded with anticipation, but his hands were steady. This was what he lived for. With each keystroke, the plan unfolded. The crew moved with precision. Each member had a role to play, each one executing their part with the expertise they had honed over years of practice. The SQL injection worked flawlessly. They gained access to Heartland's systems, slipping past the security measures undetected. Once inside, they installed malware designed to capture sensitive card data as it moved through the system. The malware was sophisticated, capable of extracting data in real time without triggering any alarms. For months, they siphoned off information, capturing millions of credit and debit card numbers as transactions were processed. It was almost too easy. The data flowed in, a river of information that promised untold riches. Albert watched the numbers come in, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He was in control, and there was no feeling quite like it. But beneath the surface, there was a sense of unease. He had always been able to keep his cool, to maintain his composure no matter what. But something about this operation felt different. It was too big, too bold, and there were too many things that could go wrong. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the thrill of the heist. But the doubt lingered, a shadow that refused to be ignored. The breach remained undetected for several months, during which the crew amassed an enormous amount of card data, 130 million numbers in all. It was the largest data breach in history, and the scale of it was staggering. But Albert knew that with every day that passed, they were running out of time. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed, before the authorities began to piece together what had happened. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of what they had done pressing down on him. But he couldn't stop. He was too far in, and there was no turning back now. When the breach was finally discovered in January 2009, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Heartland Payment Systems went public with the news, announcing that their systems had been compromised and that millions of credit and debit card numbers had been stolen. The financial world was in shock. Investors panicked, stocks plummeted, and customers demanded answers. How could a company as large and secure as Heartland fall victim to such an attack? The headlines were relentless, the coverage non-stop. The breach had shaken the very foundation of the payment processing industry, and no one knew what to expect next. Albert watched the news unfold, his face expressionless. He had always known that this day would come, but seeing it play out on the screen was something else entirely. He saw the press conferences, the statements from Heartland's executives as they tried to reassure their customers. He saw the fear, the uncertainty, the chaos that they had caused. For a moment, he felt a twinge of guilt, but then he remembered why he was doing this. The money, the power, the thrill of outsmarting the system. It was all worth it. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Heartland's CEO, Robert Carr, stood in front of the cameras, his expression grim. He spoke about the breach, about how they were working with authorities to find those responsible, about how they were implementing new security measures to ensure that something like this would never happen again. But behind his words was a sense of helplessness. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. Millions of people had been affected, and the trust that Heartland had built over years of business had been shattered in an instant. The public's reaction was a mixture of anger and fear. Customers were furious that their data had been compromised, that their trust had been betrayed. Investors were terrified of what the breach meant for the future of the company. The entire payment processing industry was on edge, scrambling to assess their own vulnerabilities, to ensure that they wouldn't be next. The fallout was massive, and it was far from over. As the authorities began to investigate, Albert knew that time was running out. The Secret Service was involved, and they were closing in. He could feel the net tightening, the walls closing in around him. But he wasn't ready to give up. He had come too far, risked too much. He was determined to stay ahead, to outsmart them one more time. But deep down, he knew that the game was almost over. The day of reckoning was coming, and Albert could feel it. He knew that he couldn't keep running forever, that eventually they would catch up to him. But until that day came, he was going to keep fighting, keep pushing, keep proving that he was the best. The Heartland breach was his masterpiece, but it was also his downfall. The clock was ticking, and there was no way to stop it. Did you remember this event? The headlines that shook the financial world, the breach that compromised millions of accounts? Investors lost millions. Customers were left vulnerable, and a payment giant was brought to its knees. If you were an investor or a customer back then, how did it make you feel? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your stories. Stay with us, because the story of how they were finally caught is even more incredible. By October 2008, the first cracks began to show. Albert Gonzalez, who had once felt invincible, was beginning to see the unraveling of his perfect plan. It was Visa and MasterCard who first noticed something off. Unusual activity, suspicious transactions, patterns that didn't fit the usual flow of business. The indicators were subtle at first. Discrepancies in transaction timings, unusual routing of card data, but soon the inconsistencies became too pronounced to ignore. It wasn't long before the alarm bells went off. Visa and MasterCard contacted Heartland Payment Systems, informing them of the irregularities. The warning was clear. Something was terribly wrong. Heartland had no choice but to investigate, and they dug deep, determined to uncover what was happening beneath the surface of their operations. Heartland's cybersecurity team worked around the clock, piecing together clues, following the trail left behind by the attackers. It was like a shadow in the system, elusive but not invisible. After weeks of investigation, they found the malware, the silent invader that had infiltrated their systems and siphoned off millions of credit and debit card numbers. The realization hit like a sledgehammer. They had been compromised, and the damage was immense. Heartland publicly disclosed the breach in January 2009, and the news sent shockwaves through the financial world. Customers, businesses, investors, Everyone was caught in the fallout. The ripple effect of the breach was massive, triggering panic and confusion among financial institutions and customers alike. As the news broke, the hunt for the perpetrators began in earnest. Heartland teamed up with law enforcement, bringing in the U.S. Secret Service to track down those responsible. The Secret Service had seen their share of cybercriminals, but this was different. This was massive, and the stakes were higher than ever. The pressure was on to find those behind the breach and bring them to justice. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. The meticulous process of analyzing digital forensics, connecting the dots between different clues, and chasing digital leads was grueling, but they were relentless in their pursuit. For Albert, it was the beginning of the end. He had always known that there was a risk, that eventually someone might figure out what they had done, but he had never expected it to happen so soon. The first hint of trouble came when one of his crew members reached out, panicked. They had heard whispers, rumors that the authorities were onto them. Albert tried to keep his cool, to reassure the others that everything would be fine, that they had covered their tracks. But deep down he knew that the walls were closing in. He could feel a tightening in his chest that he hadn't felt before, a gnawing dread that grew with each passing day. The Secret Service worked tirelessly, tracing the breach back to its source. They followed the digital footprints left behind, piecing together the puzzle, one fragment at a time. They tracked down IP addresses, analyzed chat logs, decrypted encrypted messages, each clue bringing them closer to the group behind the breach. It was a painstaking process, but they were relentless. They knew that the people they were after were some of the most skilled hackers in the world, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. They were up against individuals who had mastered the art of covering their tracks, and they needed to be precise, deliberate, and above all, patient. Albert's paranoia grew with each passing day. He became erratic, refusing to communicate with his crew except through the most secure channels. He moved from place to place, never staying in one location for too long. He knew that the authorities were closing in, and he was determined to stay one step ahead. But it was exhausting, and the pressure was beginning to take its toll. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time he heard a knock at the door, his heart would race, convinced that they had finally found him. The weight of his decisions bore down on him, each day more crushing than the last, and he began to question if the thrill of outsmarting the system had truly been worth it. The crew began to fracture under the pressure. Some wanted to lie low to stop all activity and disappear. Others were in denial, convinced that they could outsmart the authorities, that they were too clever to be caught. Albert tried to hold them together, but he could feel it slipping away. The camaraderie that had once united them was gone, replaced by fear and distrust. They were no longer a team. They were a group of individuals, each looking out for themselves, each trying to find a way to survive. The tension between them was palpable, and even the slightest disagreements became heated arguments, with accusations flying and fingers pointed. The digital trail left behind was not as clean as Albert had hoped. The authorities were able to follow the breadcrumbs, small mistakes that had been made, moments of complacency that had left traces in the vast digital landscape. By the end of January 2009, the Secret Service had gathered enough evidence to act. They had traced the breach back to Albert Gonzalez and his crew. They knew who they were, where they were, and how they operated. The time had come to bring them in. The agents had worked for months to map out every detail of the group's activities, and the culmination of their efforts led them to a series of early morning raids. It was early morning when they made their move. Albert was staying in a small apartment, the windows covered with thick curtains to keep out prying eyes. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if they were caught. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment, but when the door burst open, it was like everything moved in slow motion. The shock was immediate. The splintering of wood, the shouts of the agents, the bright lights piercing the darkness of his room. He felt a surge of adrenaline, but there was no escape. They had found him. The agents swarmed the apartment, guns drawn, shouting commands. Albert didn't resist. He knew it was over. He raised his hands, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and resignation washing over him. They cuffed him, read him his rights, and led him out of the apartment. The street outside was lined with police cars, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow in the early morning darkness. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, curious about the commotion. Albert kept his head down, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. The weight of his actions, the magnitude of what he had done, bore down on him as he was escorted away. As they led him away, Albert couldn't help but think back to the beginning, to the thrill of the first breach, the rush of knowing that they had outsmarted the system. It all seemed so distant now, like a different lifetime. He had wanted to prove that he was the best, that he could take on anyone and win. But now, all he felt was emptiness. The game was over, and he had lost. The confidence that had once fueled his every action was gone, replaced by the cold realization that he was just another criminal caught in the act. The news of Albert's arrest spread quickly. The mastermind behind one of the largest data breaches in history had been caught, and the world wanted answers. How had they done it? Why had they done it? The headlines were relentless, the coverage non-stop. For Albert, it was the end of the line. He was facing decades in prison, his name forever tied to one of the most infamous cybercrimes in history. The pursuit was over, but the story was far from finished. The trial, the sentencing, the fallout, it was all still to come. The consequences of his actions would reverberate for years, both in the lives of those affected by the breach and in the future of cybersecurity. Stay with us as we delve into the final chapter of this incredible story, the trial that would decide Albert Gonzalez's fate, and the impact that his actions had on the world of cybersecurity. The chase may be over, but the consequences were only just beginning. In August 2009, the legal tides began to rise against Albert Gonzalez. It was a sweltering summer, and the weight of his actions over the previous years was finally coming to bear. The federal indictment was swift and unforgiving. Albert, who had once considered himself untouchable, now stood before the formidable machinery of the United States judicial system. For the mastermind behind one of the most notorious cybercrimes in history, this was the beginning of a long and arduous reckoning. Albert Gonzalez was charged with multiple counts, each carrying the weight of the many lives his actions had affected. He was indicted for his role in orchestrating the Heartland payment systems breach, along with his involvement in several other high-profile data breaches, including those at TJX Companies and Hannaford Brothers. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read aloud: wire fraud, conspiracy, unauthorized access to protected computers. Each count painted a vivid picture of the deliberate and calculated acts that had shaken the very foundations of cybersecurity. As the trial progressed, Albert's facade began to crumble. He had been a former government informant, working closely with law enforcement to help bring down other hackers, but now he found himself on the other side of the law. The irony was not lost on anyone present. His betrayal of the trust placed in him by the government only added fuel to the fire of public outrage. It was a bitter reminder that even those tasked with protecting the system could fall prey to their own greed and ambition. In a surprising turn of events, Albert decided to plead guilty to the charges against him. The courtroom was tense as he stood before the judge, his voice barely above a whisper as he admitted to his crimes. It was a moment of vulnerability that contrasted starkly with the image of the invincible hacker he had once portrayed. The plea deal, which was negotiated by his attorneys, was an attempt to lessen the severity of his impending sentence. But even with a guilty plea, the gravity of his actions could not be ignored. In March 2010, the day of sentencing finally arrived. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, victims, and curious onlookers all gathered to witness the conclusion of this high-profile case. Judge Patty B. Saris presided over the proceedings, her expression stern as she addressed Gonzalez. She spoke of the damage he had caused, not just to Heartland payment systems, but to countless individuals whose financial security had been compromised. The judge made it clear that Gonzalez's actions had far-reaching consequences, impacting not only businesses but the trust that people placed in the digital systems that governed their lives. Albert Gonzalez was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. It was one of the harshest penalties ever handed down for a hacking-related crime, a clear message to others who might consider following in his footsteps. As the sentence was read, there was no visible reaction from Albert. He stood motionless, his face expressionless, as if the reality of what was happening had yet to fully sink in. For someone who had spent years evading capture, the finality of the sentence was a heavy blow. The impact of Gonzalez's actions rippled far beyond the courtroom. Heartland payment systems had suffered immensely. The breach had compromised approximately 130 million credit and debit card numbers, making it one of the largest data breaches in history at the time. The financial losses were staggering. Heartland faced millions of dollars in fines, legal fees, and the cost of implementing enhanced security measures. But the financial impact was only part of the story. The reputational damage was severe. Clients and consumers alike were left questioning whether they could trust the company with their sensitive information. The 2008 Heartland payment systems breach, described by CEO Robert Carr as a gut-wrenching experience, prompted the company to heavily invest in rebuilding its reputation and strengthening security measures. Heartland not only improved its internal protocols, but also became an advocate for stronger data security standards across the industry. The incident exposed critical vulnerabilities in payment processing, leading to substantial reforms, including the push for end-to-end encryption and enhanced tokenization methods. The breach highlighted the weaknesses in data security, resulting in updates to the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. It served as a wake-up call to businesses globally, urging them to implement more rigorous security measures to protect sensitive data. For Albert Gonzalez, the mastermind behind the breach, the fallout was significant. Once a celebrated hacker, his name became synonymous with one of the biggest cybersecurity failures in history, transitioning from a government informant to a notorious cybercriminal. His regrets, tinged with defiance, reflected the fine line between genius and criminality. Ultimately, his actions destroyed lives, including his own. The breach served as a pivotal lesson for the industry. It demonstrated the need for constant vigilance, enhanced security measures, regular audits, and collaboration among stakeholders to prevent future breaches. The Heartland incident revealed the harsh reality of our digital world. Security vulnerabilities were omnipresent, and the only way forward was through a relentless commitment to cybersecurity. Albert Gonzalez's sentencing to 20 years in federal prison sent a clear message to potential hackers. Cybercrime would be met with severe punishment. The breach had a far-reaching impact, sparking discussions on the role of government regulations and consumer protections. It showed that data security required a collective effort involving businesses, governments, and consumers. Heartland Payment Systems took a proactive approach post-breach, striving to educate other organizations about cybersecurity and prevent future incidents. Gonzalez's journey became a cautionary tale, emphasizing the consequences of reckless ambition and the impact of cybercrime on victims and industries alike. And so, as we look back on the story of Albert Gonzalez and the Heartland breach, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned? How can we ensure that history does not repeat itself? The answers lie in the choices we make, in the technologies we develop, and in the vigilance we maintain. The digital world is full of opportunities, but it is also fraught with dangers. It is up to all of us to navigate that world responsibly, to learn from the past, and to build a safer future. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of cybersecurity and true crime. And remember, the next breach could be just around the corner. Stay informed, stay secure.